Islam furthered Western civilization more than Christianity, so let's get into it. I made a post on this a couple weeks ago. It got a lot of criticism and a response from Inspiring Philosophy, who disagrees with me vehemently. I'm going to call Inspiring Philosophy IP. First of all, IP, I'd like to thank you for your follow and bringing so many people to look at my account. I would also like to illustrate this one detail, which I think I overlooked in my first post, and IP, I think you have to really take this into deeper consideration. During the Dark Ages in Europe, the church was its most powerful institution. In the caliphates, of course, the Islamic institutions were the most powerful. There is a wide consensus that the caliphates were much more advanced than Europe. Scientific advancements in the Middle East far outpaced that of Europe for the time. But now, IP, I would like to get to your rebuttal towards my remarks. In the very beginning of the post, and throughout most of it, you are merely quoting historians and not exhibiting too much of your own critical thinking. You mentioned James Hannam, David Hutchins, James Ungro. I assume you read a lot of history books, as do I, so you must understand that historians are very biased, especially James Hannam. However many historians you introduce with a Christian bias, I can introduce you to those who have more of an Islamic one. You've made the mistake with your bias because you say, well, the Christian church is better because, and then you look for things to fill in the blank. That's confirmation bias. I don't care about Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, or any of the faiths. It makes no difference to me. Look at the historic trend of cultural and scientific advancement between these two civilizations, and I see the clear winner. We put this quote here stating that Christianity was essential for science to flourish in Europe. The history of civilization proves you wrong. There were very advanced societies in India, China, Egypt, Babylonia, ancient Greece. None of them were aided by Christianity, and a lot of the marvels that Rome developed were not mimicked by Europe until the 15 to the 1800s. The Christian church during the medieval times was kind of like Europe's largest corporation. Corporations make investments, and of course the Christian church made investments towards innovation to further their own ends, and of course maybe to even advance the lives of others. But once these advancements involved testing the assumptions of dogma, then it was shut down. And the institutions of the Islamic faith did the same thing. It seems they were less sensitive towards certain assumptions being questioned, which allowed innovation to grow and flourish. Now, this quote you've listed here is flat out wrong. The Christian church did acknowledge and accept the separation of church and state. The wide consensus of historians will tell you otherwise. The best example to dismiss such nonsense would be the investiture crisis between Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Pope. At the end of the 11th century, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV, wanted the power to appoint his own clergy and bishops. That is normally the Pope's purview, and Henry IV figured, well, I am the emperor of the most powerful empire in Europe. I can do what I want. Long story short, he was excommunicated from the church. He lost the support of his nobles. He was facing bankruptcy and rebellion, so he had to make a penitent journey to the Pope, in which he waited outside the Pope's doors, barefoot in the snow. A compromise was reached in which the Pope still got to be the one who chose the clergy, but he was able to give certain powers to this clergy under extenuating circumstances. Now, further down along your quote, you state that Christianity allowed the growth of a secular-oriented natural philosophy in which Islam did not do that. I would recommend you read this, guys. Pause it. Now go here. In medieval Islam, none of these conditions was met. That is also blatantly false. You've never heard of the House of Wisdom then, which was the largest library in the world, and it was in Baghdad. The caliphates had several of these types of libraries, more than Constantinople, more than Rome, Paris, London. There were books that were translated from Persian, Chinese, Indian, Greek, Latin, and scholars from Europe, North Africa, India, even farther out into Eastern Asia, came to the caliphates, to the universities to learn. Then there are the madrasas, which were the Islamic places of learning. And in the beginning of the Islamic caliphates, yes, they were just meant to be teaching Islam. But by the end of the 9th century, they were independent institutions, distinct from mosques. And they became centers for not only religious, but secular learning. So the soil in the Islamic caliphates for learning and science and advancement was incredibly fertile. more so than Europe. I'm not going to quote historians, but I'll whip this one out. Lynn Thorndike. I invite you to examine his book, A History of Magic and Experimental Science. The catalog of the great thinkers at the time, like Roger Bacon, points out a fundamental flaw in the Latin translations of all the great works. Mind you, Latin at the time was the language of science and also the language of the church. For the whole body of the Latin language, in which all sciences are written, is corrupted, and the translations from the Greek and Arabic are very defective. The greatest wisdom is thus excluded from the Latins because they do not understand the Greek and the Arabic. Now, your part about the conflict thesis, I agree with a little bit because I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that no matter what, the church will always be against science. The church will only be against science if the discoveries contradict dogma. To entirely dismiss it is a bit of a mistake because we see it today. We still see that religion is the number one blocker in the way of, let's say, stem cell research and, of course, teaching our children evolution. That is not the Catholic Church, but it is the teachings of overall Christianity that are still vehemently upheld by zealots. Talking about Copernicus, he was ordained and never opposed by any church. Yes, he was ordained. He was not opposed because he did not let his work publish until after or right before his death. Your response was that he just didn't want to be mocked by his peers, but let's just go to his own quote. For a long time, I was undecided as to whether I should publish these commentaries. They know that the Pythagoreans, formerly of the same opinion, were sentenced to death, not knowing the cause. You then go on to say that Galileo could not prove his heliocentric case scientifically, but half the Vatican supported him regardless of the fact. Galileo did not get punished because of lack of proof. Galileo was punished for violating the injunction of 1616, in which the church declared the earth's motion false and contrary to scripture, and so this theory could not be held or defended. In 1632, he published a book discussing both arguments as to whether or not the earth orbited around the sun. In 1633, he was put on trial and found guilty of suspected heresy, so he got to survive. It did not matter that the Vatican was on his side because the Pope, who has the final say-so, used scripture as a justification to condemn him. Darwin is the last thinker I'm going to disprove you on. You say the Catholic Church, incidentally, favors evolution. The Catholic Church was silent upon the publication of The Origin of Species, written by Darwin in 1859, but by 1860 there were already churches that were condemning it. In the very early 1900s, Pope Pius X spoke against evolution and all of the other teachings of modernism. It wasn't until 1950, 91 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, where the Catholic Church said that both creation and evolution could coexist. But going back to the comparison with the caliphates, the one thing that the caliphates had versus Christian Europe was much more literacy. It stressed the importance of reading, and they allowed reading to be taught in all mosques. It sounds very little compared to today, but the literacy rates in the Middle East were 2%, which was astronomically higher than what was going on in Europe. What made it so much easier for the caliphates to do this was that they learned how to make paper from the Chinese in the middle 700s. Within a generation, paper mills started spouting up all over Baghdad and spreading throughout the major cities of the caliphates. Because of the easy access of paper and making books, libraries started to grow throughout the kingdoms. And believe it or not, bookstores. Of course, this was limited to the major cities of the Muslim world, but wow. Now, IP, you erroneously quote Laura Chevalier, saying, however, the church and the royal institutions strove to transmit and teach to as many people as possible. Monastic schools were free. Monastic schools were free for the aristocracy, not the serfs. Serfs were not allowed to pursue anything like this. This isn't debated by historic scholars. There were maybe some very wealthy areas in England, maybe France, some parts of Germany, where there was a bit more access to education. Any inkling of having some public education just for the masses to enjoy did not occur until maybe the 13 or the 1400s, well before it was actually implemented. Then there's the most important fact that Europe did not start advancing rapidly until after the Crusades and, of course, Marco Polo's journeys. It was also long after the Mongol invasions, which decimated the caliphates, and then the Ottomans came in and just perverted what was left. But after the Turks took Constantinople in 1453, I will agree with you. At that point, Europe became the greatest intellectual center of the world. But it was only able to achieve that kind of fanfare because of what they got from the East and the destruction that the Muslims faced from further east. Anyway, IP, thank you very much for your response, and I wish you well.